So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Phillip Moll to you, who has a real passion for Shoal Bay. Shoal Bay is a special place. It's a site of special wildlife interest, which is a DOC classification, and it has quite a few threatened and at-risk bird species that live or visit the place. Phillip is a wildlife photographer, and a very good one, and is very keen to showcase the threatened and at-risk bird species that live there, in the hope that we continue to improve and provide a safe haven for these birds so close to such a rapidly growing city. So welcome, Phillip. Great.
Thank you very much, Richard. And can you all hear me? I've got quite a quiet voice because I watch wildlife. You know, I always have done since I was about this height. And in later years, I took up to using a camera as well. But I do have a quiet voice. First of all, I'd like to make sure that we're all looking at the right place, because Little Shoal Bay and Shoal Bay get very confused with a lot of people and the local press as well. So I prefer to call it Big Shoal Bay. And just to get your bearings of where we are here, the Onawa interchange on the left over here, Tough Crater, the warehouse, Hauraki Primary School, Hauraki Corner, Bayswater over here. And what I'm particularly interested in is the birds there and these shell banks, these white areas that you can see, and how important they are for birds. Let's just have a look at the sort of environment of the place. Looking with our back to the motorway, as you're going up Highway 1, looking across towards Bayswater, that's the kind of view, mudflats, tidal mudflats. Up in the top left corner you can look across, there's these shell banks, some of which get covered by the tide, and you can see Rangitoto Island in the back. I hadn't really appreciated how much higher it is than Hauraki Corner where I live. Picture on the left is Ngātauranga Bay. Paul Duffy gave me this picture a couple of days ago, which is down at, we think around the Devonport area, but gives you an idea of how it would have looked way back in the past. And Upper Shoal Bay, that's the area behind Barras Point Road. I think this is a fascinating area because it's full of vegetation, it's full of mangroves, it's got this beautiful ecotone vegetation, that transition between marine, water and the land. It's also got the Petone Walkway over here with a Kermadec Pudakawa along there. You don't need to go up to the Kermadecs, you can just go down to Takapuna. And shell midden sites along the edge, a historic site. All of this is part of Shoal Bay. It's also called Takapuna Estuary. I noticed that on the Auckland Council very often refer to it now as Takapuna Estuary. I've not heard of that before.
Phillip,
yes?
Feedbacking, and you need to stay behind the cord to
okay.
out of range of the speaker.
Can you hear me?
We're just getting an echo.
Okay, thanks John.
Okay.
Now the area I'm really interested in, as I say, is these shell banks in the tidal estuary. And we're looking down from Jutland Road towards the city, towards the harbour bridge, and that's this white bank here, and they're all around the estuary. But my story really begins in Miranda, on the shell banks, the Chenier Plains of Miranda. I'd always mistimed the tide for watching birds there. By going the scenic route down to the Coromandel, always the wrong time. So I decided in November 2011 to go down there and be about a couple of hours before high tide. And I settled down with my camera just north of the Hides and was watching wrybill. Really thrilled to see this amazing bird, wrybill. I was aware that someone was approaching me, and it was a young woman with a large tripod and an incredibly impressive bird-watching scope. And she joined me. And we chatted there about birds, and I became aware that she was an expert, very observant person. And as she approached me, she said, you know, you're keen, you're early, what are you watching? And we talked about the wrybill. And we talked about a whole range of conservation issues, etc. And I happened to mention that I'd seen on a website this gadget that Auckland Zoo use that's got mirrors, 4 mirrors, and it's used for photographing Archie's frogs. The frogs are put in the centre of it, a camera's up above it, and they photograph the patterns, and that's a way of identifying frogs. And she turned to me and she said, that's amazing. And I thought I've really impressed her, you know. And she said, that's amazing because that's what I do, that's my job. She said, you must come with me and spend a night on a Coromandel mountain frog monitoring. and so the only difficulty with this was, you know, who was I to sort of turn this offer down, was how I was going to get this past my lovely wife, Terry. Now, Terry is my sort of support person. She puts up with my camera gear, you know, strewn around the house, my dirty clothes, my, you know, muddy boots, etc. But she has absolutely no interest in getting wet, tired, cold, and muddy, as I often do with my adventures. And so it was that we went frog monitoring. And we went off into those hills, and they took me to this, or she took me to this secret location, deep into this bush, virtually blindfolded and sworn to secrecy. And we collected up these frogs. And I think we collected about 16, and I found 3. It's very difficult. About 2 o'clock in the morning, her boss came along and joined us. We collected up all the frogs, took them out of the forest, back up to the ute, and there in the back was this gadget. Now you're asking, probably, what has this got to do with Shoal Bay? Well, it gave me a real insight into these amazing creatures. There I'd been watching wrybill. Out of 10,000 bird species on the planet, we've got the one with right turning beak. You know, this creature only is found, it's endemic to New Zealand. 5,500 left. And this other creature, this diminutive frog, on the edge of extinction. So it gave me a real awareness of these threatened species. The other thing it did was was something niggling away in the background about these Chenier plains, about these shell banks. And so I went back to my home at Harricka Corner and I went down to Shoal Bay and had a closer look at these shell banks. And I thought, what's different about them? They're the same. So I looked it up on the Landcare site, and there was a piece about Chenier banks saying that they're a very rare feature on a world scale, only found at Miranda, that's the only one that's gaining shells, but they're also found in, yes, you've guessed it, Shoal Bay. Also a couple of other sites like Stillwater and Pollen Island. But we have them below Jutland Road and Eversley Road. And here they are, these barrier banks. And I was thinking then, you know, if they're important at Miranda for birds, why wouldn't they be important here? And you get these convoluted shapes. They're formed by longshore drift of the waves moving along these dead shells. They're cockles, they're little neck clams. And the little neck clam is endemic. This particular clam is endemic to New Zealand, another only found in New Zealand. And you see how tightly packed they are here with silt and sand and mud. And that gives you an idea of the sort of landscape, the environment of Shoal Bay. And we're looking across to the city, you can see the Sky Tower. The second eureka moment was when this flock of birds flew over me very quickly and I fired off my camera. I didn't have a clue what they were. And they landed down in front of me. There were 38 of them. I was able to count that. Very useful with a camera. You can count flocks of birds very well, very easy. And they were wrybill. And I muttered under my breath, Shoal Bay and Mini Miranda. Well, it wasn't the first thing I muttered under my breath when I saw them. But I became interested to think, well, maybe I should do some more research on the birds of Shoal Bay. I looked up on the web, absolutely nothing at all about Shoal Bay. Little Shoal Bay, yes. Shoal Bay, nothing. Except, hidden away on the council website was this fact, that it was a site of significant wildlife interest. Now, I apologise for all the information on this slide, but I'll just read some of it out, the significant parts. This is in the District Plan June 2002, updated October 2010, but I found out later that this was designated a lot earlier than that. It's estuary, Type 3 estuary. It covers the Tough Crater Lagoon, Onipoto Estuary, Ngataranga Bay. Its ranking is moderate high. It's the description, a large number of wading and seabird species which utilise the intertidal area. Mangroves feature in the border between land and sea, and this is the habitat of the at-risk banded rail. There are 5 other coastal bird species using the area as recognised as at risk, including NZ dotterel, reef heron, banded dotterel, Caspian tern and wrybill. And then the more common species may be present in very high numbers: South Island pied oystercatcher and pied stilt. So I thought it might be quite interesting to, research that a little bit more myself. In the meantime, I've been on Motuora Island and met up with DOC staff person Chris Green, and he'd asked me, I was helping him with his wetapanga project there, and he asked me what I was interested in, and I explained Shoal Bay, and he said, that's what I do. He said, I did that designation in 1987, and it became set up in the early 90s. So it's roughly 25 years ago. And those birds were considered at risk then. And most of them, as you see, are still at risk. Nothing's changed. So these are my famous 5. These are the 5 main birds. And I've added the secretive 6th, the banded rail. I couldn't quite push it to the secret 7. You can see what books I read when I was at school. So I start with the dotterel. The dotterels are doing reasonably okay because they're managed. If they're not managed, they will probably decline. They need that care, they need those sort of bait stations around them. They need that taping of fences around their nest sites, etc. Threatened, nationally vulnerable, endemic, only found in New Zealand, 2,000 plus of them. You get this distraction behaviour. Now, this was in 2013. I don't like to cause this. If you're causing this distraction behaviour, you're too close. And so I feel I failed, if I cause this to happen. But the sharp-eyed ones of you will notice up in the top right, that bird had bands on its legs. Yellow, green, orange W. And this is on the shoal banks in Shoal Bay. This bird, I was fortunate to find out this year by being invited to the Dotterel Forum up in Omaha. And John Dowding was there, and I got chatting to him, and he sent me some information about the birds. And I'll talk a little bit more about John in a minute. This bird was banded by him at Shoal Bay as a breeding adult in November 2003. It had a nest at the time up in Warehouse Way, in the grass in front of the warehouse building. It hasn't moved far and must now be a minimum of 15 years old. Many dotterels last into their 20s, but very few seem to make it past 30. So these are our resident birds, and there are others. These are birds that stay put there, and some of them have probably been there longer than we have. So you're talking 15, 20 years, some of them. And we also have these other migrant birds, I'll talk about in a minute, from the South Island, and other birds from international migrants that come in. This is about 3 months later, and you see it's in breeding plumage here. I just found this slide the other day when I blew up some pictures. So it makes a good point of never deleting anything. And here it's with a mate. So why are they in Shoal Bay? What's the attraction? And I've been asked that by quite a few people. Why do they come to Shoal Bay? Why don't they just go somewhere else? The reason is feeding, breeding, roosting. That's resting. Pretty much the whole point of what we do by living around the edge of Shoal Bay, maybe. Feeding, of course, is the main thing. If there isn't food there, birds don't come. So there's food in Shoal Bay for birds. And they like this low tide situation. Not necessarily when it's completely low tide and it's dried out. The waders and other birds like that when there's a bit of water there, because that brings out the invertebrates, the worms and all the rest of it start coming out. And that's when the birds go in there to start pecking away at that food. This is how dotterels, because crabs make up a lot of their diet, this is how they deal with it. They flick. This isn't Photoshop. They flick at them and flick the crab up. They flick it up into the air, and they've got to keep it out of the water because these are tunneling crabs, and they'll be down those holes as quick as, until they catch it. This one's flicked a bit of shell up as well. And then bit by bit they tear off the limbs. Gross. But that's life for a dotterel. Breeding plumage. They get into that breeding plumage pretty early. When we're up at Omaha, April, and they do at Shoal Bay. And here they are on the shoal banks. And here's a pair. I've dated these slides, but they do move around for different dates, so mix them up. And that's their territory. That's where they are hoping to breed. Most of our dotterels, and quite a few of our other birds, favour down the side of the motorway. And you all know about the busway project in around 2006-2007, which caused great controversy because the shell was helicoptered out into there to make up for the loss of nesting sites where the busway project went. And people said, well, that's ridiculous, spending all that money, because some of the birds were trying to nest on the construction site. But if you think about it, they've been used to that whole area down the side here, right the way down. And then you put a busway down, and you give them 5 or 6 shell banks. Now that may be one bird's territory, and they've got to compete with Caspian tern, black-backed gulls, variable oyster catchers as well. And these are those shoal banks. But they are successful and they are used by birds. And Eric's here from the Auckland Motorway Amalgamation. If I got that right, Eric?
Motorway Alliance.
Alliance, sorry. I should have checked with you first. But they do a great job in monitoring this area and also trapping and bait stations there for the rats. You've heard about Nature Path. We were very concerned when a design company, Reset Urban, put forward the idea of putting a pathway down that side of the motorway, the Shoal Bay side of the motorway. Oh, sorry. And we were concerned that this would cause disturbance to those areas, and we proposed Nature Path on the left here, on the western side, as a better option, also to connect in with the community. And I defy anybody, if you go onto this crossing here, the motorway crossing, I'm a Brit, and there's no way, they were proposing sort of sanding a lot of this, making it into a walkway and all the rest of it. There's no way I would want to take my bucket and spade there and enjoy this area. So territory, how large is a dotterel's territory? Well, I asked my friend, and she said, do you remember Bo? This is a bird that we've been watching. Some birds have huge territories. They have more mana. Others have a smaller territory. So it's very difficult to pin that down. But territory is very important to these birds. And I'm going to show you this photograph because although it's not taken at Shoal, it's taken up further north on the east coast. It's pretty important to show what happens when you disturb these birds. If you disturb those chicks and push them away from the adults, you make them very vulnerable to predators. And that can be also other birds. It can be other dotterels, it can be variable oyster catchers, etc. And when I took this photo, I didn't know that it had a bird. I thought it had seaweed, but I took a series of pictures. And this was up on the Paukari-Mangawhai coast. And I thought, this looked quite interesting, this photo. And I'd figured that it strayed into another bird's territory. So if you imagine those shell banks, if you're walking with your dog on those shell banks and those birds get separated from the adults, this can be their fate. From another bird or from a hawk or black-backed gull. While I was on that coastline, I walked further up the coastline and it was raining, it was a pretty windy day, and I was aware of one other person. And we had our hoods down, and as I approached I realised it was a young lady with a tripod and an incredibly interesting bird-watching scope. And there was a feelings of deja vu, but I had to go and say hello. And as I approached, I said, "What are you looking at?" And this was Elian, and we became great friends. And Elian was watching fairy tern up on that coast. And we also talked about dotterel. And I said, "Well, have a look at this picture." And she said, "That's very interesting." And that's very subdued for Elian. That's very interesting. She said, "Could you send me a copy of that so that I can send it to John Dowding?" And I said, "Yes, sure." But at the time, we just didn't hear anything back. But John was up to his eyes in oil, dealing with the Rena disaster and the recovery of those dotterels down there. And it was only this year, when I got invited up to that dotterel conference, the forum, that I knew John was going to be there. So I took a print of this along. I put it in front of him, and he said, "Wow," he said, "I've never seen that before." He said, "What do you think's happening?" Well, I had this romantic notion that this bird had been killed by another dotterel or another bird, and that it was trying to catch it up with its other two chicks. And he said, well, what he thought had happened is by the damage in the back of its head, it'd been pecked at by a variable oyster catcher. And then it was trying to get it out of its territory, get it away, because of aerial predators. And John said that he's very often seen dotterel tidy up their nests, move the shell and fly it out over the sea and drop the shell. So it's that survival. A chick pick. This is how the other chicks should look. And this is what we, want more of in Shoal Bay. But you can see how vulnerable they are. This is the hawk that, I haven't seen it recently, but this is the hawk that comes out of Tough Crater, flies over into Onipoto, flies over the motorway, and my wife always hangs on her seat when we're driving down the motorway because I'm spotting birds. And she said, "Concentrate on your driving." And this is a little shelter. You see this shelter at the bottom here? This is a dotterel shelter, and I photographed that in 2009. And when I met this lady, Elian, I told her about this, and she said, "That's what I did. That's one of my shelters, 2009. So you got all these little connections. This is the post-breeding roost of dotterel. They gather up on the shell banks after breeding. And this is a group of about 13. There's just 6 here that you can see in the photograph. But our dotterels very often are found up in this situation, this crazy situation, up in the car park by the warehouse and Samsung building. And at this time, at 3.1 metre high tide, there are 18 New Zealand dotterels and 8 banded dotterels. And there they are, these little dots. And they like this kind of area because it's predator free. They've got a good sight line, so they need a good sight line. They don't want any bushes nearby that predators can be in. That can be cats, rats, dogs. And you can see why they picked that point. And they probably always have done, because that's in that car park here. And so the breeding sites will be down here. Their roosting site will be all around here. And then they can see the tide go down, and then they can head off and pick the best places for feeding. And this is our second bird of our famous 5. The banded dotterel, a little bit smaller than the New Zealand dotterel. Threatened, nationally vulnerable, endemic, only found in New Zealand. And when the cars are in the car park, they move out onto the grass. But more of that grass is being built on for car parks. Clever little bird, this. It's very good eyesight. Most of the plovers do have good eyesight, and that's how they feed, by their eyesight. Other birds use tactile movement with their feet to spot prey. The Pavlova connection. I read in Keith Woodley's book that some of the banded dotterel that live further south in the South Island don't come up to the North Island in the winter. They decide to head off to Australia. And in the 1800s, the early 1800s, it was discovered that by a Scottish naturalist there, and they were named the double-banded plover. And the Australians still call it that. And they claimed it as their bird. Hence the Pavlova connection. But it's a New Zealand bird, it's ours. And here are a mix of birds on the Ngātauranga high tide roost on the Shoal Bank. At the same time, 35 pied stilt, 156 variable oyster catcher and sipos, South Island pied oyster catcher, 9 banded dotterel. You can see the banded dotterel here. New Zealand dotterel, and there were 3 Caspian tern at the same time, and 72 wrybill in flight. 72, that's a pretty significant number, and I've seen to just over the 100 mark. Brings us on to the wrybill, still there, still in Shoal Bay, of our 5 birds. Threatened, nationally vulnerable, still an at-risk bird. Endemic, a very unique bird because of that bent to the right beak. And this was the first 3 I saw on Shoal Bay that year in 2015. Just 3 arrived. And they come there in about April and they molt initially. They've come up from breeding in the South Island in those braided river areas. And that beak, there's all sorts of theories, but one of the theories is that they can sort of turn over stones, etc., down in those braided rivers for feeding. But when you kind of think that they also come to the mudflats of the Manukau Harbour and our harbours around Auckland, maybe there's another purpose. And another idea that's been put forward is that because the bend of that beak, when it's put down on the mud, it has quite a high surface area, surface contact, and they like sifting through algae. That's where they get their food. It's going to be difficult to prove that with a camera, because you can imagine they're a long way off. And that was the first 38 that I saw in flight, a little bit more of an enlargement. And here they are at the various shell banks. And there's one banded dotterel over the back, just there, along with pied stilts. Oh, and a variable oyster catcher. And 2 Caspian terns here. 65 wrybill, whole collection of birds. There they are. This would, I sort of crop down to these because otherwise you can't see it. I try and show the whole lot. But so quite high numbers of birds using the shell banks of the area in flight, disturbed. I think this was an aeroplane very high up that they possibly thought was a hawk. And here to give you the scale, this starling flew up with them, so it gives you an idea of the size. And my friend at Miranda used to describe, when we watched wrybill flying there, that it was like a child's magnet. You know those toys when you had magnetic filings and you get a magnet and you swirl them around? You know how the light, and she described that beautifully, I think. And this is in Ngātauranga Bay. Our next bird, the Caspian tern, a native to New Zealand, also found in North Africa and Asia, other areas. Fantastic bird to watch. I saw one of these yesterday there. And here he is having a look. Fishing time, an hour either side of high tide. And he's going for it. And they very rarely miss. If they don't think they're going to catch it, they pull out of the dive. They're not going to get wet for nothing. And they like the mangrove areas. They like those areas. I think it's because there are fish probably in there. And providing the water's clear, they're in. And then they're up. And this one, if you notice, a sort of mottled head. It's an immature bird. It's not a breeding age bird. And there's a breeding age bird having a rest. That's what they do after that's what the high tide roosts are about, having a rest after you've done that fishing, after you've been feeding. For the other birds, the pied stilts that have been out at low tide. Territory pretty big, I would say. As far as I know, there's only sort of one pair that nest down the motorway side again. It's so important, that side, because if you think that motorway is a real barrier against predators, dogs, cats, rats, they've got to get across that. And the last bird of those 5, the reef heron. Well, I've just about given up on the reef heron. It's a very timid bird to watch, but it is one of my favourites. And I took these up on the Parkeri coast, and they have this, what I call this stealth bomber look. Do you know? This crouched down, ready for action, stealth fighter, stealth bomber look. Very typical. They're endangered, of course, nationally endangered. Oh, sorry. And it was only in May this year that I eventually saw my reef heron. And I saw it from that motorway bridge. I've been scanning with my camera, watching white-fronted tern. And I suddenly got the jizz of a bird. Alan, could you explain the jizz for me, please?
Well, it's something about the bird that you can't describe, but it makes you instantly know what it is. And one of the best examples, I think, is when a blackbird flies across the road and lands on a tree stump or a post, it always lifts its tail up and then puts it down again.
Right.
So no matter how dark it is, or how misty, or how early in the morning, when you see the tail go up, you go, blackbird. And it's the jizz that tells you it's the blackbird.
Yeah, it's just that feeling. And for me, as the tide came in, of course, it put its wings up, so I was sure what it was. But for me, it was that stealth bomber look. So that's the thing to look out for. So that's the only one I've seen in 3 years. It may be that I'm on the wrong side. You usually find these about where it's a little bit more rocky, the shore. A good place is down at Huia, down in the Waitakaris. Pretty guaranteed to see them down there. And here's some shots of them up on the east coast, just so you get a feel for the bird. Very proud with that tiny fish. You've got to catch a lot of those for a bird that size. And here in flight, how they look in flight. So I think it's probably a good time to just look at the white-faced heron, just to compare. Quite a different bird, and this is up on that gantry. This one flew up to have a look at me. Very often when you're out, you know, the birds, it's their territory, like that hawk. That came over to have a look at me. It's in their interest to know what's going on. And a plea for trees in any restoration project, large trees, it doesn't matter whether they're natives or not. They are so important for birds. They're protection, somewhere where they can go to get away from strife, from trouble. They're nesting sites, they're roosting sites, they're feeding sites. Kingfisher love to feed up in high trees. They feel safe. This one's just showing off. Now they switch their diet at certain times, particularly when the tide's right in. And you can see this in Tough Crater, Mount Victoria, North Head. If you look along the pathways, particularly when that tide is right in, there's no rock pools to feed on, they feed on skinks. And if you look on the picture on the left, you see its neck's sort of twisted because they do this oscillating movement. And it's fascinating to watch because the skinks kind of get looking at this and they're not looking at this. And up in the top right there is a picture of a rainbow skink, which we call the plague skink, you know, the import from Australia. And I just wish we could train them to just go after those. So, the importance of Shoal Bay. It's a site of significant wildlife interest. I've since found it's an area of significant conservation value. It's an area of significant natural heritage value, and it's a proposed Auckland Unitary Plan, significant ecological areas M1 and M2. But at that time, that was the only signage I could find telling you anything about this wonderful area. So, with our committee's support, Forest and Bird Committee, I talked to them and said, you know, maybe we should have some interpretive signage. And maybe we could have some signage that made it clear where people could take their dogs. Okay, we're still working on that. Just so that everybody kind of knows and there's an appreciation of what's in this area, this wonderful area. And we sent that off to the council. I sent that off with GPS locations and photos of the entrances. And we got this sign and we were absolutely rapt. In fact, we got two, one at the end of Jutland. Absolutely rapt because it acknowledges it's a wildlife reserve and talks about dogs on a leash. Well, that's since changed. It's now no dogs on those areas. But in August of that same year, I'm not out to bag people that have dogs. You know, people love their dogs, and I have friends with dogs. My daughter has a dog. It's not about that. It's about just understanding what's going on. And this is very important to see where they're walking along the top of this shell bank. Not out to bag them, out to put boxes on their head, though, for privacy reasons. Because, and I probably missed it that year, but in October 2015, I noticed two dotterel along on that very spot, and they seemed to be interested in moving shells around, and I was watching from quite a distance. And I went and had a look and saw these nest scrapes. What happens is the male makes the nest scrapes, and eventually the female sort of picks one. You guys will understand that kind of process. And there's another. There were three that I could spot. They're quite difficult to see. A little bit easier on a sandy beach. And so I decided to watch from 156 metres away. And I know that because my GPS meter told me that. And so I carried on watching. And can you see the bird there? Yeah. And I sent this round to our committee, and Claire said, help, she said, there's some high tides coming. And we got really worried about this, but I checked my photos and checked against the tide and the strand. I reckon this would be about a 4 metre tide here, and figured that they picked a pretty good spot. And so we contacted the council to put an orange tape around it, like you see up along the coast. And they went one better. They put this tape across the whole of the spit, the whole of that shell bank. And I spoke to one of the locals down there. They were horrified. This truck arrived, this big truck with huge fencing on it, and explained that they were going to put a fence across. It sounded like the Berlin Wall was going across, but it was just this tape fence. And this made a huge difference because we got what I think is possibly our first eggs, dotterel eggs, away from that motorway site. And I watched from my distance. I only went there about twice, I think, to check the nest. In the meantime, we got our interpretive signage. And Paul Duffy, Paul is here tonight, and the parks people have been really great help to us, and so is the biodiversity team as well. And they came to the party and they agreed to fund this for us. Richard's daughter Kate did the design. Of course, I supplied the photos and some of the text. And Paul said, yes, we'll put one down at Charles Street. And Richard and I and the installer and Paul met there. And I rather cheekily said, well, while you're making one, would you perhaps consider making another one? And he said, where would you like it? And so we had a look, and it seemed that round on the other side of the pipeline bridge would be a good place, near Paddy's Bush. I often wonder, Paul, if I pushed it to a third one over at Lansdale.
We just put two more in.
Have you?
There's one at Sandy Bay and one at Lansdowne.
Oh, fantastic. Exactly. Just the spot. Thank you. And so now we had our signage, and there was an update to the dog review in 2015, October 2015. The ruling changed to no dogs on the foreshore in these areas. And so we got a temporary piece of signage up there. Now this is Takapuna Beach, and this is all our beaches up the coast. Now you imagine that bird that I've showed you sitting on that nest, you know, week after week or day after day. It has absolutely no hope up on any of our beaches now. And these people are enjoying themselves, as I do, walking along the beach there and chatting to each other. Now, Shoal Bay supports more than 1% of the dotterel population with approximately 10 breeding pairs and a post-breeding flock of 35 birds. That is a Ramsar Convention criteria for being recognised as a site of international significance. So, you know, the estuary is a sort of really a no-compromise area if we're going to do anything for these birds. Oh, and back to that nest of 3 eggs. Well, 2 of the eggs disappeared, and I thought chicks, but I couldn't find them. And I kept at a great distance. I didn't want to disturb them. No shell around it, and the bird continued to sit on this egg. But it seemed to go beyond the incubation period. The good news is they're back on territory. I took this picture 2 days ago. The birds are back on the exact same spot, and they look comfortable, don't they? So the choice is ours. If we put that tape fence up, if we put our dog signage up, if we kind of talk to people and just keep away from it, we have a chance. And I think all those little shell spits should have the same treatment. And then hopefully we'll see this. Well, on the subject, because we weren't sure what had happened to those eggs. Maybe it was predators, rats, etc. And we got involved with the Northwest Wildling Assistance Programme, again through Paul and Parks, for predator control. And there's Annalise up on the right there, and Amy, Joel over on the left, and Joel in the middle, I should say, Bill up on the left. Joel works for High Point, and he's the council contractor to help us put those bait stations in. And we've since been back and checked them, and probably getting on for 50% of the bait had been taken. And so we've now got this sort of corridor of bait stations around. The red ones are the ones that have been taken up by volunteers. Other groups over in Ngātaringa Bay. Those green ones now have been taken up by Amy and Elise. I'm doing some here. Bill and Garth are doing some of these, and we've got other people over here. Some of the bush along the edge of Shoal Bay is probably the most significant bush on the Devonport Peninsula. You know, there's very little. But this is wonderful. This has got bush lawyer in it, it's got tongue fern, it's also got moth plant and pampas and all the rest of it. But you see, the birds don't mind that. We do, but the birds don't mind. But if we can get more native plants going, that's all good, because they'll spread those seeds. With a unitary plan, this area, if you dig through those horrible layers, hidden is that this is a special precinct, considered a special precinct. This will end up 4 stories high. That means a lot of people, a lot of pets. Now that Northwest Wild Link, which I hope most of you know about, that idea of having a corridor between the islands and the Waitakaris, in hopefully attracting these sort of birds, or at least giving them a landing place en route. I'm not sure that the saddleback would do very well with cats, because it's a ground hopping bird. But these I took on those islands, Motuora, Motuhi and Tiri. But I would like to say, hey, we've already got birds in this area that, are living, and there's a lot of birds that are doing okay around Hauraki Corner. We get 9 tui in our garden regularly. So the birds that are already there, the little waxeye, that's in Tough Crater, feeding on the tautra seeds. Tui, grey warblers, they're all present, these birds. Great. By spreading that predator control right across Devonport, which Paul and his team have been doing really successfully, everybody's getting on board with it, with the hope of bringing caribou back. But I also think we'll need some bigger trees, some food plant trees for that to really happen. They seem to be in Tough Crater. Stansitch Reserve is fantastic for caribou because there's some big kaigatea trees there, which they really love. That ecotones transitional sort of vegetation around the edge is so important and so attractive with these sort of plants. The rimu, the half flower as I call it, that's over near Paddy's Bush. Glasswort, we used to call that Marsh samphire in the UK. It's a bit of a delicacy in some restaurants there. It's eaten like asparagus. And bachelor's buttons down here. This is a great sort of area for birds to forage in and hide, and wildlife to move between land and water and reverse. And mangroves, love them or hate them. I've tried to paint this in a good light, an evening light. But these birds love them, and make no mistake, if you take away the mangroves, these are history. They used to be pretty common throughout New Zealand up until about the 70s, when stoats seemed to go after them, plague of stoats. And although they are found in some pockets, I think they're found down in Nelson, they're mainly in our estuaries, the mangrove estuaries in the north of Auckland here. Their range is about 4 hectares they kind of need, and so there's plenty of room in Shoal Bay. They've been seen in Shoal Bay, Upper Shoal Bay and Tough Crater, where I photographed this one. So they're there, threatened again, nationally vulnerable. Romeo and Juliet, my wife thinks this is probably not a good name for a couple of birds because they didn't have a very happy ending, did they? But it seemed appropriate. That's Dad and Mum. And I know that's Dad and Mum because they always perform for me. They have done for the last 3 years whenever I approach with my camera. And so October 2015, and then eggs. And they've nested each year on that sandspit at Charles there, and have been successful. And there's the eggs. So you've got to walk very carefully, and don't walk along the top of those shell banks. Walk down below if you do walk on shell banks at all, because it's very hard to see these eggs. I GPS things like this, and I use that meter because it's so hard to see them. Those eggs disappeared. Again, a clean nest site. Had they cleared the shells away, I couldn't see the young. But then this was a telltale sign. They went up after this hawk, so there must be chicks around. So I looked a little bit closer, found the chicks, 2 chicks. So I've just got one in the photo. So they're existing down there, getting on with life. And that was when I first saw them. 3 chicks. The little one didn't survive. You see how vulnerable they are? Now you imagine a dog running ahead of you, if you have a dog. You never see what was going on. You know, they can't fly, they can't swim. And if you separate them out, that hawk is just looking for that opportunity, or a black-backed gull Site fidelity of these birds. This is another family that I saw. That's the adult in the back, and it's one of its young in the foreground here. See the bands on its legs. I also asked John Dowding about this bird. It was banded as a chick at the Wade River mouth near Silverdale, 1995. It first bred in that 2000 season in Shoal Bay. It's been there ever since. Now 20 years old, which is probably a respectable middle age for a variable oyster catcher. Many disappear in their 20s. Disturbance. How close is too close? I put boxes over people's boats and things here just for privacy again. That's a little bit deceptive, that distance, because of my camera. You know, with the long lens you get that distortion, but they're not that bothered about this. So I like the idea of, you know, everybody enjoying the place. It's not about limiting. But there may be some need for education about how close you come to these areas. Maybe there could be some sort of marking. But some people kayaking and enjoying themselves. That was a great day down there. Just get a little bit too close. Fortunately, those birds didn't have chicks at that stage. And if they had chicks, those birds would have gone after those people. As you know, with variable oyster catcher, they would do that. Dotterel can't do that quite so effectively as a variable oyster catcher. South Island Point oyster catcher, playing a bit of golf here, and I was just interested. I had my camera there. Just, you never know with wildlife what it might do, how it might react, but it just ignored this. This is in Ngātauranga Bay. And here they are. There were 200 South Island pied oyster catchers down there that day. And on the same day, and I photographed this the day after, 2 days after, there was another 100 or so the other side. And with that movement of the tide coming in, as it starts to swamp those shell banks, they'll fly around to the one that's still a bit higher. But there's still room for more birds. It's not like Miranda where they're getting crowded out. And at low tide, off they go, down to feed. Just to give you an idea of how these birds look in appearance, Saipos, South Island pied oyster catchers in Ngātauranga Bay, and Romeo and Juliet in Shoal Bay. You can see the sort of difference, much clearer defined markings. And variable oyster catchers do have white on them sometimes. That's a pied version, a pied morph version, or the male bird at the back is a black morph, a dark morph. A couple of juveniles pestering their mum or dad. Black-backed gulls, these can be a bit of a pain with nests, but they are a clever bird. And they do, like everything, you know, all has its place there. It's cleaning up. You know, otherwise the place would stink, you know, but these birds are... And this one, I crack up. If you look at its face and look at the mud, it's had a real tussle getting this thing out of the mud. And it's trying to get it into a place, a dry place, where it can eat it. So it gets it down on the foreshore. And I bet gets it down. Look at that face. And of course we have eels there. North River Reserve, they're about 1 metre long. You can see 10 or 12 down there. And I was astonished that these birds don't seem to mind the gecko and the ducks. You think, you know, one of those eels would have their legs off. It's always worth taking a photo, even if you don't quite know what's going on. But I always think that this bird had come along at Shoal Bay and somebody had their breakfast out on the deck and they got distracted by the kettle boiling and it's got the toast. Takeaways. And rubbish day, those birds come in from Shoal Bay and they come inland. And this bird, our rubbish day, Hauraki Corner, where I live, got changed from a Wednesday to a Tuesday. This bird came on a Wednesday. I wasn't there on Tuesday, unfortunately, but I was there on that Wednesday morning. It zigzagged, it tacked up the road looking for rubbish bags. And of course, there's always somebody that gets it wrong, and it's usually me. And it found the rubbish bag. And my friend Elian said, why don't you phone the council and see if you could get them to occasionally change the day so you could run an experiment? and I said, my neighbours weren't too happy about me photographing and watching and letting the birds do this. But I'm okay with this because at least they're not feeding on young chicks or young birds or whatever else. And the elegant bird of Shoal Bay, the pied stilt. Look at that. It's a beautiful bird, isn't it? Declining, of course. You know, it's a native bird. And packed in those shells at the back. And you can often see these flying over the bay. In fact, I saw quite a few yesterday. And if you've been to Miranda and they talk about the stilt ponds, you know, when you're looking out watching the birds at the hide and the stilt ponds are behind you, we've got our own stilt ponds at Shoal Bay. And here after crabs. High tide roosting on those shell banks, so important. As a consequence of the fence that Paul and his team put up, that tape fence, we also had, so we've got variable oyster catcher, we've got the dotterel, we also got 2 pairs of pied stilts nesting there. And this pair were quite intriguing because they were working away here tending a nest area. It's not much of a nest, it's just a few twigs. But there are also, and here they are again, just here, but there are also some godwit on there, 9 godwit. And in the bottom picture, I kind of think it possibly was the male. I don't know for sure because both sit on the nests, sit at the nests. But it started to chase these birds off, these 9 birds. It didn't seem to be aware that the shell bank had got split by high tide. And on the other shell bank were 118 godwit. And they decided to join the 9. And in there is a pied stilt, still sitting on its nest. So you know it's a nest. I mean, otherwise it would have been off. So here we are, 118 godwit. The bar-tailed godwit. So this is our international visitor, our international migrate. They arrive in September. They've flown 11,500 kilometres from Alaska in one flight. And they arrive in Shoal Bay. And they just want to what? Rest. They don't want to be chased by people or disturbed. They just want to rest. And they want to feed to get back into condition. And that's what they do. And then as the season goes on, they start to colour up in these tundra colours, ready to leave in March. And here they are. In those Arctic colours, in those Alaskan colours, you know, to merge in, ready to breed. They've got to fly up via China, up to Alaska, a round trip of about 30,000 kilometres. 112 there were here, just down in Shoal Bay. Here they are getting a little bit agitated, and the reason? A hawk flying through. And there they are, up the top. Other birds, pied stilt, threatened. These often get caught in fishing line. I found a few, not at Shoal Bay, but up the coast, Milford. Little pied shag. These have got real character. They're doing okay, apparently. It makes a change, doesn't it? It's nice to hear that good news. And also there's the little black shag that there's a great writing in our blog. Murray Ward had written about them rounding up fish in Shoal Bay. I haven't seen that there. I've seen it up on the Parkary coast. And kingfisher. See how worn out this one looks up the top? It's done so many flight missions feeding its young. They get really worn out at the end of the season, chasing after those mud crabs. Tough Crater, on the edge of Tough Crater to Shoal Bay, I took this photograph. This is a young one, waiting for its parent birds, bringing down a cicada. So they can switch their diet. So the threats to Shoal Bay, well, development on the fringes, Auckland Unitary Plan, who knows what effect that will have on the bay. Silting, second harbour crossing, unlimited access causing disturbance. That's just as an education thing, I think. Pollution. Well, the Lake Papuki oil spill in some ways showed, how the team can work, at the zoo and for dealing with such a problem, because, that could happen at Shoal Bay. We've got Barris Point Road is a sort of semi-industrial area. Increased sea level, well, who knows how that will affect. And crazy ideas, like sanding the area, making it into a theme park, who knows? The opportunities for the area, well, I took a UK birder here, a guy I met on Rangitoto Island, Ed Bennett. He's a wildlife ranger in the UK. I took him down there and he said, "This is amazing, why don't we know about this place?" Some people do, and we do get visitors from overseas. I took a little group down here, which was really good fun. We saw Caspian tern and pied stilt. So there are opportunities, and local schools do use this area. Hauraki Primary go down. There are other schools too. So is it the most livable city for our birds? Well, they look pretty relaxed at the moment. Well, we live in the sort of chaos all around with our traffic and our unitary plan that we're doing, our infill building in the leafy suburbs to try and, have a compact city. But, oh no, we've got that wrong now. We've got to urban sprawl. They don't really require very much at all. Just a little bit of understanding. And there is potential, I think, for a lot more birds. And so I think I'll just leave you with Romeo and Juliet and hope that they continue to have these happy endings. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Are there any questions? You can talk to Phillip afterwards too, and you can also come back for the next few meetings.
We're not running
because he's here all the time.
Yes, sure.
But thank you, Phillip. That was extraordinary.
Yes.
It just shows you what one man's enthusiasm and passion can do.
Well, there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of help from these guys.
So.
Yeah.